Good afternoon. I'm assuming that everyone in this room has at some point in time created and led a successful, high-performing team. If that belief is correct, then the only thing that you need to do in order to create and lead a successful, high-performing culture is to scale up from what you've already done. Cultures are big versions of successful teams. And we know how to scale things up. The way you scale something up is you take a look at the examples that exist of success. You understand a sufficient amount about the theory and practice that surround that success, and you deconstruct the examples of success, and then you use the theory and practice to reconstruct a new example of success at a new scale or in a new venue. That's the sort of thing that we did when we took lean from the Japanese culture to the Western culture. It's the sort of thing we did when we took lean from automotive manufacturing into chemical plants and refineries. And it's the sort of thing that I'll encourage you to do when you think about scaling up from a successful, high-performing team to an industrial culture. Let me first give you a couple seconds on the theory of culture. Culture is a sociological sort of concept, and what the sociologists will tell you is that a culture is comprised of four elements. The first one is values. When people share a value, they begin the process of forming a culture. The second one is beliefs. Based on your values, you believe certain things. Third one is behavior. Based on your values, you believe certain things and you behave in a certain way. And the final step in that process is rituals. And rituals are, this is the way we do things here. So I'm also assuming that you folks are smart enough to remember those four things. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about the theory and practice of creating a culture. And I'm not going to name all the pieces for you every time. You can figure out for yourself which pieces we're talking about. I'm also not going to give you an economics lesson, but I am going to use this data set, and it's based on statistical quality control, or Six Sigma. But I understand it's impolite to do math in public, so we're not going to actually do any math. What we're going to do is use this chart to talk about what most people call systems thinking. The data set is a really convenient data set, but like I said, we're not going to talk about economics. But the data set is 1,000 months of performance of the U.S. stock market. And we can talk about that because everybody in here will share the same sort of experience. This 1,000 months of data includes the Great Depression, includes the Great Recession, it includes all the times in between. The really interesting thing about this chart, and the dimensions on the chart are horizontal, the monthly total return of the stock market, and vertical, the frequency with which that monthly total return occurred. The red line is the actual data. The blue bars are the actual data normalized using Six Sigma techniques to create a statistical model of the system. And what we're going to talk about with this chart and the next chart is system thinking. So what do you think about this system? What most people notice first is the red line has a lot more activity at the center than the blue bars of the statistical analysis predict. If the statisticians in the crowd agree with me, I'll tell you that doesn't hardly matter. The fact that your system has a greater central tendency than the statistical model predicts is pretty much transparent in your analysis and use of a system model. And the reason you create a statistical model of your system is so that you can use it. So what do we know about this U.S. stock market? One of the interesting things is the most common monthly total return is 1% a month. Over 1,000 months, the most common monthly return is 1% a month. Anybody in here like to get 1% a month on a routine basis? I'm guessing y'all would, huh? Hardly anybody does. Why is that? Because most people don't actually think that there's a system in place, and most people don't think about the system, and therefore they don't use the system to guide their actions. Everybody says, I'm going to buy low and sell high. What do people actually do? They go way over to the end of the chart. There's a lot of bad activity. Things are bad. I better sell. What does the system tell you about a lot of bad activity? What's the next thing that's likely to happen if you know about the system? The next thing that's likely to happen is it's going to move more towards the center. Over 1,000 months through the Great Depression, through the Great Recession, over 1,000 months, a period of lots of bad activity is routinely followed by movement towards the center, even movement towards the other end of the spectrum. What happens at the other end of the spectrum? Everything's really good, I better get me some of that. Okay? Everything's really bad, I ought to sell. Everything's really good, I better get me some of that. That results in the vast majority of people buying high and selling low. So there is a great value in understanding how systems work and managing according to how systems work. The other really interesting thing on this chart, and I hope you can see it, the red line, although it's kind of irrelevant that it predicts a lot more central tendency that actually occurs, the red line way out on either end, back where the statistical model says nothing is happening, actually takes an upturn. There are things that are worse than the statistical model of the system predicts, and there are things that are better than the statistical model of the system predicts. And essentially what that begins to tell you is there are things that happen outside of the system. And that turns out to be really important. Let's take a look at the next slide. Same scale. Across the bottom, the monthly return. The vertical scale now for the red line remains the frequency. The vertical scale for the blue bars shifts to contribution. What's the contribution of each one of those monthly returns to the total return over 1,000 months? Really interesting. Almost 8% of the total return was things that happened outside of the system that were bad, and 4% of the total return was things that happened outside the system that's good. Now, I'll tell you the reason this is, it's not just a convenient data set, it's actually a data set that you reproduce a lot of times when you start modeling a system. You can take control of the system. If you know about the system, if you understand how the system works, you can get great advantage from managing according to the system. You also have to be alert to the fact that things are happening outside of your system. Things that happen outside of your system that are bad can happen by accident. Your job as manager is to find those and prevent them. Things that happen outside of the system that are good only happen if somebody causes them to happen. Okay? So you kind of get a sense for how system thinking works, because I'm going to spend a lot of time talking to you about the things that managers have to do. Here's the first thing that managers have to do. You have to create the system. Whether you like it or not, everybody in your organization works within a system, and whether you know it or not, you have already created the system within which your people are working. And the vast majority of the people who work in a large organization are average. That's kind of the essence of a large number of people doing something. They're average. There used to be that Prairie Home Companion radio show where Garrison Keillor said, in the town of Lake Wobegon, all the children are above average. And of course, that's not possible. Huh? It's also not possible in a large industrial organization. And that's perfectly acceptable, except what you have to understand is, if you have a large enough population that your people are in general average people who are working at an average pace of diligence, whether or not you succeed more or less than other people is going to depend entirely on the system within which you as the leaders create for those people to work in. Okay. Creating the system within which your people work is largely the thing that determines the success of your organization. The next thing you have to worry about is managers have to manage the routine operation of the system. You create the system and then you make sure that people use it. Then you manage exceptions that occur within the system. There are things that happen within the system that prevent people from using the system as you expect. As a manager, that's the point where you have to intervene and make something different. You have to identify and manage the adverse things that might happen outside of the system. You have to identify and lead the capture of good opportunities that exist outside the system. So let's talk about how do you create a system. The first thing you have to do is give people the goals that you will pursue. And you have to give them the goals that they'll pursue in terms that enable them to contribute. The company I work for has a goal of producing 1 million barrels of oil a day. You go to a person who's all by himself working on a truck at midnight on Sunday and say, how about them 1 million barrels of oil? He's going to blink at you and keep on working on the truck. If you go to the person who's all by himself at midnight on Sunday and say, our goal is to produce 1 million barrels of oil, and the way you contribute to that is to treat this truck like it's a pit stop, get the truck back in the mine, and by the way, I'll teach you how to do that. Then all of a sudden he understands the shared goal, and he understands his role in the shared goal, and now he can help you. If you don't go through that process, you'll never get that outcome. You have to give people skills. It doesn't do us any good at all to walk up to a guy who's working on a truck at midnight on Sunday and say, what I'd really like you to do is, instead of taking 72 clock hours to perform the maintenance on this truck, I'd actually like you to do 3 of them during this 12-hour shift. Doesn't sound possible. It doesn't sound like something that he's interested in doing. But if you teach him the skills of SMED, if you teach him how to plan his work, and you give him a nice 5S orderly workplace with all of the attributes that will enable him to have the tools and the equipment and the experience and the parts, if he has everything that he needs, and he's been trained how to use all of those things, all of a sudden you can begin thinking about doing 3 trucks in one 12-hour shift instead of 1 truck in 72 hours. But we have to give people those skills. They don't naturally have them. You have to give them access to the resources that cause change. If you want them to cause change, you're going to have the resources that cause change. In some cases, that means engineering. In some cases, it means money. In some cases, it means time. We control people's access to all of those things when they're at work working for us. And if we need those resources in order to cause change, we have to provide those resources. Time is a spatial attribute of resources, because time is one of the things that when people are at work we control the most closely. If we want people to take the time to do their work and have the time to cause improvement, we actually have to give them that time. And quite often we want people to cause improvement as part of a team, or cause improvement as part of a cross-functional team, not just their natural work group, but other people who are interested in the same improvement. We have to give them time, and we have to schedule the coordination of that time so that the teams come together. We have to give them boundaries. People at work all know that there are boundaries that cannot be crossed, but we very rarely spend the time to define those boundaries for them. If we want them to cause change, we have to be able to give them the boundaries within which change is permissible. When people are working on our big trucks, they can do things, but they can't change the steering. They can't touch the brakes. Okay? They know what the boundaries are. Give you a specific example of the value of knowing what boundaries are. We run 400-ton trucks. The truck will carry a 400-ton load. Typically, our shovel operators put 4 scoops into the truck, 4 100-ton scoops. Routinely, everybody in the industry knows the 10-10-20 rule. 10% of your loads can be more than 10% greater than the rated capacity of the truck. None of your loads can be 20% greater than the rated capacity of the truck. Everybody knows that. The result, though, is the shovel operators were routinely underloading our trucks. We only put about 360 tons in a 400-ton truck. We put an onboard weighing system, so as the shovel operator loads the truck, it tells him how much is already in the truck, and then he knows whether to put in a big scoop or a little scoop for the 4th shovel. Turns out we're now routinely carrying 430 tons. We got about a 20% increase in the capacity of our fleet of trucks just by telling the folks where the boundaries were. They knew there was a boundary, and they were afraid of crossing it, so they historically didn't get close to it. Those are important things. You need to give folks a framework for action. And what we mean by a framework for action is, if they're going to cause change, and especially if they're going to cause change as part of a team, There has to be a way for the team to come together. There has to be a way for the team to know how they propose ideas to their team members, how the team members together vote to promote something from an idea into action, how they allocate the resources that are available to the team. You have to actually give the team the ability to conduct that intelligent improvement activity, or they can't do it. And finally, you have to give them a process for change. And basically, the process for change has to be one that leads up to a new one right way of doing things. You can't just have people making random changes. All of their changes have to lead to a new one right way of doing things. So that's how you create a system. And we can talk more about that, or you can learn more about all of those things, but those are the things that you do to create a system. How do you manage the routine operation of the system? The first issue is routine things have to happen routinely and autonomously. And what I mean by that is you can put things into the system that you're creating every time you can go through this litany. In this situation, do this thing in this way within these boundaries. Every time you can take an activity or an opportunity or something within your business and go through that litany, in this situation, do this thing in this way within these boundaries, you can make that activity part of your system. And when something is part of your system in that way, your people can have some autonomy. They can recognize what the situation is, and therefore what they should do in what way. And they understand what the boundaries are. They understand their freedom to respond to changes within the system. They also understand where they don't have the freedom to respond. And the reason you have to create the situation so that people can do routine things routinely and do them autonomously is if you actually try to manage all of the events in your factory, you'll find that you can't. Nobody is smart enough or fast enough or good enough to manage everything that happens. You have to create the system so that routine things happen routinely and autonomously, and that gives you the ability to not manage some things. There also, as part of your system, must be only one right way of doing things. Everything must have one right way of doing them. A couple reasons for that. Let's say we're in the process of causing improvement, and I come up with a nice improvement, and Steve says, "Oh, thank God, Ray's really a dummy, and I'm glad he's finally improving. Thank God I don't have to improve." Turns out you don't get any real benefit from that. If we're in the process of improving and I come up with an improvement, I have to convince Steve and all the other people who are doing the same thing that I'm doing that I've come up with a new one right way. And when we've all agreed that there is a new one right way, we'll document that, and that will be the same one right way from then forward for everyone. What happens? If you don't do that, you get a little bit of improvement, but it's not sustained. If you don't do that and everybody's got their own personal one right way, it's really, really hard to make a big improvement, because my change that I've created isn't the same change that's going to take Steve from his one right way to the new one right way. It's different. The process of change gets to be that much harder because everybody's starting from a different place. The process of change gets to be unsustainable because everybody can make changes or create their own way without following the process. The process becomes unmanageable because management doesn't know what to manage. As you create your system, there must always be one right way. Even if you're talking about a lot of improvement, even if you're talking about a lot of change, at all points in time, everybody has to do it the same one right way until everybody agrees that there's a new one right way, and then everybody has to do that. There have to be measures of compliance. You have to know with some certainty that everybody's doing the things that you expect, and you have to be able to demonstrate that. And there must be measures of performance. There is no expectation that we'll be really good at practicing lean. There's an expectation that our business will benefit from practicing lean. Okay? So you have to manage, you create the system, you manage the routine operation of the system, then you have to manage exceptions to the system. There will be a day when the people who are following the litany in this situation do this thing in this way within these boundaries, when the boundaries are exceeded. They stop. They know they can't go forward because you've told them where the boundary is. You must manage those things. And typically the way those things are managed in a really good system is for the leaders to have their own leader standard work. And the leader standard work might be something like, I come in at 6 o'clock and I have a meeting with the person who's going home at 7, the shift leader who's going home at 7. At 7, I take over my shift. I give everybody their safety meeting for the day. I give everybody their instructions for the day, and I set them out for work. I take a safety tour and make sure that the workplace is as it should be. And then I go to each of my teams and I say, are you able to do the work that I've given you? And they'll tell you back the things that stop them from being able to do that. And then at 9 o'clock, all of the shift team leaders come together, and they come together with the engineers and the supply chain people and the warehouse people and anybody else that they need to form a cross-functional team that can resolve those problems. And by 9 o'clock, the things that are exceptions to the system that will stop your people from being successful today, somebody is working on those, not with the intent to resolve them next week or tomorrow, but to resolve them in order for us to be successful today. And you have to manage non-compliance with your system. There are always people who decide that they actually have a better way and they're not going to do it the one right way. You can't let that occur. Because people have a tendency to watch very closely what their colleagues are doing, and if you allow some folks to not perform according to the one right way, then pretty soon there will be more folks who are not conforming to the one right way. This is the really interesting part. Remember out there on the ends where the system said nothing was happening? It turns out any set of data that you analyze, there's always stuff that happens outside of the system. At external events, and there's good external events and bad external events. You actually need to understand what sort of abnormal events can cause you problems. Remember, in the stock market situation, 8% of the total effect over a 1,000-month period was caused by things that happened outside the system that were bad. In our plants, there are things that can happen outside the system that are bad. Give you a specific example in my plant. You all know about the fire triangle, huh? Fuel, heat, and oxygen. My plant, we're typically processing hydrocarbons, and a lot of it is over 1,000 degrees. As soon as any of that gets out, where there's air, or any air gets in, fire triangle closes. Huh? So we spend a lot of time working on what we call losses of containment, any little place where the material might get out of the pipes. That's our biggest risk, and we brought that into the system. Now, we have about 12,000 people plus 12,000 contractors, so we've got 24,000 people who are all eyes and ears looking for the slightest evidence that anything is starting to get out of the pipes. You might have a gasket that's begun to leak just the tiniest amount, and there will be a little smoke or a little bubble. And somebody will call it to our attention, and we'll work on it before there's a loss of containment that could lead to an adverse event. We actually took the most significant source of adverse events that are outside of our system and brought it into the system because everybody's looking for those things. That's the sort of thing that you have to be able to do. And you have to make sure that good things do happen. The introduction of lean practices, the introduction of any serious improvement has to be led by management. You have to enable people to cause improvement. You have to tell them what the goals are. You have to give them the skills. You have to do all the things that cause serious improvement to happen. And serious improvement often will not happen unless somebody causes it. Management and engineers and other professionals still have the obligation to make their contribution to serious improvement. We spend a lot of time talking about autonomous improvement, but managers and engineers have a role to play as well. And they can create interesting strategies like, let's greatly reduce our capital expenditure by rebuilding 40-year-old equipment or rebuilding our big trucks. There's nothing that will reduce your capital expenditures faster than if you can stop buying things that you already have. And there's a large number of plants that call it sustaining capital. Huh? Let's go buy something that we already have. Management can lead the change where people start devoting their efforts to rebuilding what you already have instead of buying it again. probably notice I'm the oldest person in the room. In fact, my wife the other day, Suncor always sends, they send a thing and it says your normal retirement day is, and I said, yeah, that's the day I retired. That was before I joined Suncor, though. In fact, my wife asked me, does Suncor have a mandatory retirement age? And I said, no, I don't actually know. And she said, well, then they don't. And I said, how do you know that? And she said, well, if they did, they'd be talking to you. In any event, I've been around for a long time, and I've seen a lot of really excellent companies, and I'll tell you with some certainty, every really excellent company has these three things. They have goals translation, both vertical and horizontal. Vertical is from one boss to another boss to another boss, right down to the last guy in the last row. You tell people exactly what your organization expects to achieve. And horizontal. There's a surprising amount of vertical goals translation that results in people doing something that makes the guy next to them worse. Sounds like an improvement, but it actually improved your operation at the expense of somebody else. I'll give you a specific example. One of the senior leaders in our supply chain organization read in our magazine article that he didn't understand and he remembered part of it. That's a really bad combination. What he ended up doing, according to the magazine article, was an excellent supply chain organization has a certain number of people for a certain size of purchase. Yeah, I can fix that. I'll just get rid of a lot of people. Turns out that's not how you achieve that ratio. So we actually had a period of time when the supply chain organization was reporting outstanding performance, and all of our mechanics were standing at the window looking at parts that they couldn't get because there was nobody to pass them through the window to them. So there's a really important issue, making sure people understand what the goals are so that they can help you, and making sure that people understand horizontally what the goals and aspirations of the people around them are so that they work together and not at cross purposes. Every really successful organization does that, and they do it very well. Every really successful organization practices engagement. It's actually true. It's irrevocably true. If your managers, engineers, and professionals are your only source of improvement, you have no chance of competing. Give you a specific example related to that. I started my career at General Motors, and in the 1970s, GM was the largest, most profitable industrial company on the planet. They actually were. And I can tell you with some certainty that today they're a much better company than they were in the 1970s. The products are better, the efficiency is better, quality is better. But 2 years ago they went bankrupt. How'd that happen? How can a really good company spend 30 or 40 years getting much better than they were and then go bankrupt? Everybody else got more better. Everybody else got better faster. When you're talking about industrial performance metrics, it's really interesting to look at your current performance, which is a measure of, it's a lagging indicator, it's a measure of how successfully you did the things that you did before. The much more interesting measure is, what's your current pace of improvement? How successfully are you doing the things that will change your performance tomorrow? The one thing that you can certainly do that will change your performance tomorrow is get a lot more people engaged in causing improvement. If you have 12,000 or 24,000 people causing improvement, you're certainly going to be a lot better than the people who are making 3,000 or 4,000 people their source of improvement. And you have to continuously introduce new tools and capabilities, and especially as you begin to engage more people, you have to introduce the set of tools that look like Lean or Six Sigma or other forms of continuous improvement, because those tools are routinely designed specifically for people at the front line. Okay? Managers and engineers aren't really going to do SMED the way that the people at the front line would do SMED. Okay? Managers and engineers aren't going to 5S the workplace to make the workplace right the way the people at the front line will do it. There's not enough managers and engineers. You're not good enough or smart enough or fast enough to do all that you need. But those tools are uniquely created for people at the front line to do those things and get real value from it. I've kind of talked through these already, so I'm not going to do that again. I like this slide because this slide talks to the issue that I just described. It doesn't actually matter what your current state of performance is. whether you're the best company in the world or a company that's just starting out, like Toyota was in 1970 in the Western markets. Your performance is in the lower left-hand corner compared to where you want to be. And this portrays a strong bias of mine. I never tell anybody that they're bad. I never have that conversation with anybody. I only tell them that they could be better. So wherever you happen to be, your performance is in the lower left-hand corner, your performance isn't as good as you might want it to be, and your performance has higher variability than you might want it to have. So what do you do with that information? The big green arrow says managers and engineers have a role in causing improvement, and the improvement that managers and engineers cause is typically big event improvement. Let's create a new product, let's create a new process, let's buy a new piece of equipment. The interesting thing about that is over a long period of time, managers and engineers causing all of the improvement in an organization create about 3% compounding annual improvement. A lot of the folks in here missed it, but in the early 90s, there was a big sweeping trial across North America of people who wanted to have very flat organizations, autonomous organizations, self-directed work teams. Turns out that a purely self-directed work team, which is kind of the little green arrows, over a long period of time, they create 3% compounding annual improvement. And the only thing I can think of that correlates to that is managers and engineers acting alone or self-directed work teams acting alone. They kind of keep up with inflation. They don't actually cause a dramatic change in the performance of an organization. But you can also see from this chart that what becomes possible is managers and engineers can do their part and the self-directed work teams can do their part, and then you start looking at 2 threes. And actually for each of those there was a range from you did it wrong so things got worse up to about 6% compounding annual improvement. So you might be talking about 2 sixes. And we've heard a couple folks throughout this conference begin talking about a continuing series of performance where against the strategic goals of the enterprise, they actually achieve 10% or more compounding annual improvement. And I can tell you with some certainty, for more than 30 years against the strategic goals of the organizations that I've run, we've averaged between 16 and 20% compounding annual improvement. You can't actually do everything at that pace, but you can attack and successfully complete your strategic missions at a 16 to 20% compounding annual improvement. That's how you start pulling ahead of the folks that are currently having better absolute performance than you have. Now, every business person has stories from the front line, and I'm going to share with you some stories from our front line. I would suggest that as I tell each of my stories, one of you is going to say, yeah, we did that. But you're likely to say, I remember when we did that once 2 years ago because we really needed to. If you're going to be a world-class organization, what you need to be able to say is, yeah, we did that 20 times last week. So as I tell the stories and you say, yes, we did that, think about when you did that and how frequently you did that. This particular example is we have these big trucks that haul 400 tons worth of ore, and they have big engines. When we first started, it took 250 clock hours. Actually, there was a guy from Cummins here, and I was pimping him the other day because he was telling me how good his engines are. And I said, we've never gotten one of them to last more than 15,000 hours. And what I'd really like is 25 or 30,000 hours. Settle for 18 if you can get it. But when we first started, it took 250 clock hours from the time a truck pulled into the shop until it pulled back out with a new engine in it. The first time we taught our teams the SMED application, the truck pulled out in 50 hours. And today we can change the engine in a 400-ton truck in one 12-hour shift. And when you can get an activity to the point where you can do it in one shift, really changes the performance because they don't have to spend all this pickup and put down time transferring from shift to shift. I already told you that it used to take us 72 clock hours to perform what's called an S1, the initial routine service for a truck. And now we do 3 of those every 12-hour shift. So how do you do that? Well, SMED's part of it. 5S is part of it. You set up a workstation, and all all the S1s come to the same workstation, and it's got all the tools and all the equipment and all the parts, and the technicians in that workstation are really good at doing that particular activity. The other reason I showed you this picture is in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a little blue hose. The really interesting part about that is as we began taking the engine change out much faster, the technicians told us something that none of us had known. The little blue hose is the coolant manifold, and in the original configuration as we purchased these trucks, that cooling manifold was a rigid piece of pipe. And a big engine fitting into a big truck fits with a little lanyard, doesn't precisely fit. So as they changed the engines, one of the things they did was lean real hard against the pipe and weld her in place. Pipe started off under stress. Rigid pipe in a big truck running through a mine experienced a lot of vibration. Those pipes were always breaking, and the trucks were always coming in to have a new piece welded in place. As we began talking to the folks about doing this much faster, they said, how about we use a hose instead of a rigid pipe? Go a lot faster, it won't come back in. We said, hey, that sounds good. But you don't have the authority to change the design of the engine. We need an engineer to look at that. So the engineer came over to the team that had come up with this idea, studied her all up and said, yep, that's a good idea, and then the team put it across all 143 of our big trucks. Okay? So we told them what the boundaries were. They came up with an idea, great improvement managers and engineers would have never found. They came up to the boundary, the engineer touched it and said it's okay, and they went ahead and did all of our trucks. I like this. That's kind of a list of some of the things we begin teaching our folks when we want to give them the skills of improvement. The thing on the right-hand side of the page is what's called a spaghetti diagram. And basically, it's the simplest tool of getting started on SMED. And what you do is you ask the guys to track where they go as they do a particular activity. The spaghetti diagram on the top is an actual spaghetti diagram from one of our activities. Because we're running big trucks with big loads in a mine, we routinely pull the trucks in and take an oil sample to make sure that there's no evidence of something in the oil that would indicate the engine's having a problem. If you blow up one of those engines, it's a $500,000 mistake. But we have 38 bays in our truck shop, and the algorithm used to be, truck needs an oil sample, you pull it into any bay, and whoever happens to be there takes the oil sample. Well, that results in the spaghetti diagram in the upper right-hand corner. Guys took about 3 hours to scurry all around, and they gathered up the stuff that they needed, the tools and the bottles and the labels. And then they performed the oil sample, and then they scurried around a while more. Today, we do enough oil samples that in our 38-bay service garage, there's one bay that does service ones, the routine service I told you about, plus they take oil samples. The spaghetti diagram on the lower right-hand side is the travel path for the guys in that bay. It now takes about 8 minutes to do what used to take 3 hours because the bay is set up for it. It's got all the tools, all the equipment, all the parts. The guys know exactly how it's done. It takes about 8 minutes and they go home. We had folks who went through this spaghetti diagram exercise and they showed up the next morning wearing a pedometer. They said, you know, all I did yesterday was 3 oil samples. I don't understand why I went home beat. Then they knew why they went home beat, because they were walking around for 3 hours trying to gather up stuff that they didn't have. Now they spend 8 minutes doing that activity, and the trucks spend their day in the mine. We can actually talk to folks about having the trucks spend their day in the mine instead of in the shop. That makes sense to everybody. I can't tell you about big business outcomes because that's not my job, but I can tell you about small business outcomes. We did things like activating the onboard weighing system so every truck carries an optimal load. We did things like changing the amount of time that it requires for a service one, for an oil sample, for an engine change, for an engine strut change. All of those things now associated with keeping the trucks in the mine are much faster than they once were. The trucks are more in the mine. The trucks are carrying heavier loads. The trucks are more reliable. The trucks are actually able to run at faster speeds because they're more robust. With the same fleet of 143 trucks that we used to have, we're now carrying twice as much ore. Okay. Interesting outcome. In 4 years, we doubled the capacity of a fleet of 143 mine trucks. Same thing works in our process applications. Basically, at Suncor, we take the oil sand, we dig it out of the ground, we release the oil from the sand, put the sand back in the hole, and it usually fits. Then we take the bitumen, which is a big, heavy molecule, and we crack those big, heavy molecules and produce much lighter molecules that start looking like synthetic crude oil. And then we have something that looks very much like a traditional refinery where we produce a variety of other things, including diesel fuel for our own trucks. We had some initial belief that our refining capacity was limited by what's called a steam blowdown system. I'm not going to try and describe that to you, but everybody believed that the steam blowdown system was the problem. And it turned out we used one of the tools of improvement called an opportunity radar. And an opportunity radar is really simple. What are all the things that might impact this problem, and are they really hard or are they easy? If they work, do they have a lot of value or a little bit of value? And what we found was all of the heavy heads, all of our engineers had an idea that the steam blowdown system was the problem, and a couple folks said, well, it might just be the temperature sensor. And all the heavy heads said, no, not the temperature sensor. But you put that on the opportunity radar, and the opportunity radar says, if it's the temperature sensor, you solve the whole problem, and it's really easy to do. An instrument technician can make that analysis for you in about an hour. Turned out an hour was all it took, because that actually was the problem. And you can see we went from losing a lot of production to about 3 months later, there was no production loss as a result of that, and there has been no production loss as a result of that for 3 years. I'm running out of time here. So, we use the 5S tool a lot. We call it Make the Workplace Right. Everyone in here knows the attributes of 5S, so I won't talk too much about it. But here's some examples of how that impacts us. On the left-hand side are all the pieces associated with the centrifugal separation units that take the last little bits of sand and water out of the oil so that we can process it without eroding all of our pipes. And on the right-hand side, you see the same workspace after we've cleaned it up, made it more orderly. The centrifugal separators, before and after, the after picture is different. And the after picture is different in a way that we can spot a loss of containment. In the before picture, there's been so many previous losses of containment, you can't actually tell if there's a current loss of containment, but you can in the right-hand picture. We actually took that potential for hazardous outcome and brought it into the system. In that little part of our business, in a 9-month period, and this is 3-year-old data, so I don't mind sharing it with you, we had a 30% improvement in performance in 9 months, and we've sustained it and improved it since then. Here's some of our truck shops. You can see on the left-hand side the way the shop used to look, and on the right-hand side the way the shop looks today. Here's some of our parts. You can see on the left-hand side a very traditional warehouse. All the parts arrive, somebody handles them, puts tags on them according to the part number, puts them on shelf in part number sequence. The guy wants to use them. They go to the warehouse and they pull all the parts off. And in that configuration, our supply chain was saying that they were 97% successful in filling our parts orders as we came to the window and asked for parts. The difficulty was they were only about 61% successful in giving us the entire kit of parts required for whatever it was we were setting out to do. Today we've moved to what you see on the right-hand side, and that is each one of our 143 trucks, plus we've got a lot of dozers and graders and loaders and other equipment. Each one has a basket, and as parts arrive for that unit, they go into the basket. When the basket has everything that you need, then we call the truck in from the field. And the truck comes in from the field for a suspension change. It goes to the bay where they have all the tools and equipment for suspension change. It's got all the parts because the truck doesn't come until the basket with the parts are in that bay. And the people who are in that bay do suspension changes, and they're really, really good at it. They know what SMED means for the work that they have to do. Another picture before and after in our tire shop. One of the things that was interesting about this related to a cultural change is before we started this process of putting all the tools and equipment that you need for a particular piece of work in each of the bays, every one of our heavy equipment technicians had their own toolbox. It was kind of a rite of passage. If you became a heavy equipment technician, you got a big toolbox. and you hauled it around for the first half hour of every shift, and then you hauled it around for the last half hour of every shift. And the guys liked having their own toolboxes, and we said no. The other thing they did was they spent an hour every shift standing in line at the tool crib window for tools that they didn't actually have for the job that they were actually going to do. And we said, no, we're going to take all of your toolboxes away, and we're going to put every single tool that you could possibly need for the work that you're going to do in the bay where you're going to work. You should never leave your bay. You have the tools, you have the equipment, you have the parts, you have the truck. You stay in your bay and work all day on your bay, on your truck. Everybody grumbled. There were guys who were almost as old as I am who were really set in their ways, and they were giving me a bunch of crap about that. A couple months later, I went back, and the same guy that was giving me so much grief put his arm around my shoulder and said, "What do you think of my shop now?" He'd gotten used to being really successful as a heavy equipment technician, and it turned out he didn't actually like spending his day hauling his toolbox around, and he didn't actually like standing at the tool crib window. So I'm going to show you one last picture. That's the tools that we had left over after we put every tool that was required in the bay where it could be used. Okay. So culture, which is what we started off talking about, really consists of values, beliefs, behavior, and rituals. We can define the rituals. We can create a situational culture where the people who come to work behave just like a big version of the teams that we all know how to create, and we can give them the things that they need to be successful in that environment. Been doing it for a very long time, and it's reproducible enough if you take that approach that if you don't get the result you're looking for, you can figure out what went wrong and try again, just like any other experiment. Take the scientific method. If it doesn't work out, you know what went wrong, and you can get it right on the second try. I greatly apologize, but the plane for Toronto leaves at 4, and I'm going to be on it. So I can take about 2 or 3 minutes worth of questions, but I can't hang around for a long time. I'd be glad to receive a question if anyone has one. Okay. Thank you.